The government also established direct control over the education of blacks. The Bantu Education Act, 1953, took black schools away from the missions, and more state-run schools, especially at the elementary level, were created to meet the expanding economy's increasing demand for semi-skilled black labor. The Extension of University Education Act, 1959, prohibited the established universities from accepting black students, except with special permission. Instead, the government created new ethnic university colleges, one each for Coloreds, Indians, and Zulus, and one for Soweto, Tswana, and Venda students, as well as a medical school for blacks. The South African Native College at Fort Hare, which missionaries had founded primarily, but not exclusively for blacks, became a state college solely for Xhosa students. The government staffed these ethnic colleges with white supporters of the National Party and subjected the students to stringent controls. Resistance to apartheid. Apartheid imposed heavy burdens on most South Africans. The economic gap between the wealthy few, nearly all of whom were white, and the poor masses, virtually all of whom were black, colored, or Indian, was larger than in any other country in the world. While whites generally lived well, Indians, coloreds, and especially blacks, suffered from widespread poverty, malnutrition, and disease. Most South Africans struggled daily for survival, despite the growth of the national economy. After the ANC Youth League emerged in the early 1940s, the ANC itself came to life again under a vigorous president, Albert Luthuli, and three younger men, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela. The latter two briefly had a joint law practice in Johannesburg. After the ANC Youth League emerged in the early 1940s, the ANC itself came to life again under a vigorous president, Albert Luthuli, and three younger men, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela. The latter two briefly had a joint law practice in Johannesburg. The South African Indian Congress, which had also been revitalized, helped the ANC organize a defiance campaign in 1952, during which thousands of volunteers defied discriminatory laws by passively courting arrest and burning their passbooks. A mass meeting held 3 years later, called Congress of the People, included Indians, coloreds, and sympathetic whites. The Freedom Charter was adopted, asserting that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black or white, and no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. The government broke up the meeting, subsequently arrested more than 150 people, and charged them with high treason. Although the trial did not result in any guilty verdicts, it dragged on until 1961. To prevent further gatherings, the government passed the Prohibition of Political Interference Act, 1968, which banned the formation and foreign financing of non-racial political parties. Robert Sobukwe, a language teacher at the University of the Witwatersrand, led a group of blacks who broke away from the ANC in 1959 and founded the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, because they believed that the ANC's alliance with white, colored, and Indian organizations had impeded the struggle for black liberation. The PAC launched a fresh anti-pass campaign in March 1960, and thousands of unarmed blacks invited arrest by presenting themselves at police stations without passes. At Sharpeville, a black township near Johannesburg, the police opened fire on the crowd outside a police station. At least 67 blacks were killed and more than 180 wounded, most of them shot in the back. Thousands of workers then went on strike, and in Cape Town, some 30,000 blacks marched in a peaceful protest to the center of the city. Rebellion in rural areas, such as Pondoland, also erupted at this time against the controls of homeland authorities. The government re-established control by force by mobilizing the army, outlawing the ANC and the PAC, and arresting more than 11,000 people under emergency regulations. Robben Island Prison, South Africa, which operated as a maximum security prison, mainly for political prisoners, from 1961 to 1991. After Sharpeville, the ANC and PAC leaders and some of their white sympathizers came to the conclusion that apartheid could never be overcome by peaceful means alone. PK established an armed wing called POCO, and the ANC set up its military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, in 1961. Although their military units detonated several bombs in government buildings during the next few years, the ANC and PAC did not pose a serious threat to the state, which had a virtual monopoly on modern weaponry. By 1964, the government had captured many of the leaders, including Mandela and Sobukwe, and they were sentenced to long terms at the prison on Robben Island in Table Bay, off Cape Town. Other perpetrators of acts of sabotage, including John Harris, who was white, were hanged. Hundreds of others fled the country, and Tambo presided over the ANC's executive headquarters in Zambia. The unraveling of apartheid. The government was successful at containing opposition for almost a decade, and foreign investment that had been briefly withdrawn in the early 1960s returned. Such conditions proved to be only temporary, however. A new phase of resistance began in 1973 when black trade unions organized a series of strikes for higher wages and improved working conditions. Stephen Biko and other black students founded the Black People's Convention, BPC, in 1972 and inaugurated what was loosely termed the Black Consciousness Movement, which appealed to blacks to take pride in their own culture and proved immensely attractive. Soweto Uprising. Uprising in Soweto, South Africa, on June 16, 1976. Demonstrators protested state plans to impose the Afrikaans language as a medium of instruction in black schools. On June 16, 1976, thousands of children in Soweto, an African township outside Johannesburg, demonstrated against the government's insistence that they be taught in Afrikaans rather than in English. When the police opened fire with tear gas and then bullets, the incident initiated a nationwide cycle of protest and repression that came to be known as the Soweto Uprising. Using its usual tactics, the government banned many organizations such as the BPC, and within a year, the police had killed more than 500, including Biko. These events focused worldwide attention on South Africa. The UN General Assembly had denounced apartheid in 1973. 4 years later, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to impose a mandatory embargo on the export of arms to South Africa. The illusion that apartheid would bring peace to South Africa had shattered by 1978. Most of the homelands proved to be economic and political disasters. Labor was their only significant export, and most of their leadership was corrupt and unpopular. The national economy entered a period of recession, coupled with high inflation, and many skilled whites emigrated. South Africa, increasingly isolated as the last bastion of white racial domination on the continent, became the focus of global denunciation. At that time, the leadership of the National Party passed to a new class of urban Afrikaners, business leaders and intellectuals who, like their English-speaking white counterparts, believed that reforms should be introduced to appease foreign and domestic critics. Peter W. Botha succeeded B.J. Vorster was Prime Minister in August 1978, and his government introduced some reforms, but it also increased state controls. It repealed the bans on interracial sex and marriage, desegregated many hotels, restaurants, trains and buses, removed the reservation of skilled jobs for whites, and repealed the pass laws. Provided that black trade unions registered, they received access to a new industrial court, and they legally could strike. A new constitution was promulgated that created separate parliamentary bodies for Indians and for coloreds, but it also vested great powers in an executive president, namely Botha. The Botha reforms, however, stopped short of making any real change in the distribution of power. The white parliamentary chamber could override the colored and Indian chambers on matters of national significance, and all blacks remained disenfranchised. The Group Areas Act and the Land Acts maintained residential segregation. Schools and health and welfare services for blacks, Indians, and coloreds remained segregated and inferior, and most non-whites, especially blacks, were still desperately poor. Moreover, Botha used the State Security Council, which was dominated by military officers, rather than the cabinet as his major policy-making body, and he embarked on a massive military buildup. Military service for white males, already universal, increased from 9 months to 2 years and included annual reserve duty. South Africa's black neighbors formed the Southern African Development Coordinating Conference in 1979 in an effort to limit South Africa's economic domination of the region, but it made little progress. most of the export trade from the region continued to pass through the country to South African ports, and South Africa provided employment for some 280,000 migrant workers from neighboring countries. Botha also used South Africa's military strength to restrain its neighbors from pursuing anti-apartheid policies. The South African Defence Force, SADF, assisted the Renamo, Mozambique National Resistance, rebels in Mozambique, and the UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, faction in Angola's civil war. SADF troops entered Botswana, Swaziland, now Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Mozambique in order to make preemptive attacks on ANC groups and their allies in these countries. Botha kept what was then called Southwest Africa Namibia under South African domination in defiance of the UN, which had withdrawn the mandate it had granted to South Africa over the region. The country even produced a few nuclear weapons, the testing of which was detected in 1979. Increasingly, South African dissidents from all race groups were harassed, banned, or detained in prison without necessarily being charged under renewable 90-day detention sentences. During the 1980s, the conservative administrations of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Britain and President Ronald Reagan in the United States faced increasingly insistent pressures for sanctions against South Africa. A high-level Commonwealth mission went to South Africa in 1986 in an unsuccessful effort to persuade the government to suspend its military actions in the townships, release political prisoners, and stop destabilizing neighboring countries. Later that year, American public resentment of South Africa's racial policies was strong enough for the U.S. Congress to pass, over a presidential veto, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which banned new investments and loans, ended airlinks, and prohibited the importation of many commodities. Other governments took similar actions. The struggle intensified during the early 1980s and became further polarized. The new Constitution of 1983 attempted to split the opposition to apartheid by meeting Indian and colored grievances, while at the same time giving blacks no political rights except in the homelands. In response, more than 500 community groups formed the United Democratic Front, which became closely identified with the exiled ANC. Strikes, boycotts, and attacks on black police and urban councilors began escalating, and a state of emergency was declared in many parts of the country in 1985. A year later, the government promulgated a nationwide state of emergency and embarked on a campaign to eliminate all opposition. For 3 years, policemen and soldiers patrolled the black townships in armed vehicles. They destroyed black squatter camps and detained, abused, and killed thousands of blacks, while the army continued its forays into neighboring countries. Rigid censorship laws tried to conceal those actions by banning television, radio, and newspaper coverage. The brute force used by the government did not halt dissent. Long-standing critics, such as Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, defied the government, and influential Afrikaner clerics and intellectuals withdrew their support. Resistance by black workers continued, including a massive strike by the National Union of Mine Workers, and saboteurs caused an increasing number of deaths and injuries. The economy suffered severe strain from the cost of sanctions, administering apartheid, and military adventurism, especially in Namibia and Angola. The gross domestic product decreased, annual inflation rose above 14%, and investment capital became scarce. Moreover, in 1988, the army suffered a military setback in Angola, after which the government signed an accord paving the way for the removal of Cuban troops that had been sent to Angola and for the UN-supervised independence of Namibia in 1990. Given these circumstances, many whites came to realize that there was no stopping the incorporation of blacks into the South African political system. Government officials held several discussions with imprisoned ANC leader Mandela as these events unfolded, but Botha balked at the idea of allowing blacks to participate in the political system. National Party dissent against Botha in 1989 forced him to step down as both party leader and president. The National Party Parliamentary Caucus subsequently chose F.W. de Klerk, the party's Transvaal provincial leader, as his successor. More than 20 years younger than Botha, de Klerk exhibited more sensitivity to the dynamics of a world where, as democracy arose in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the blatant racism that still existed in South Africa could no longer be tolerated. De Klerk announced a program of radical change in a dramatic address to Parliament on February 2, 1990. 9 days later, Mandela was released from prison. During the next year, Parliament repealed the basic apartheid laws, lifted the state of emergency, freed many political prisoners, and allowed exiles to return to South Africa. Post-apartheid South Africa, the Mandela presidency, transition to majority rule. Nelson Mandela visiting a school in Johannesburg, South Africa, 1993. Mandela was elected president of the ANC in 1991, succeeding Tambo, who was in poor health and died 2 years later. Mandela and de Klerk, who both wanted to reach a peaceful solution to South Africa's problems, met with representatives of most of the political organizations in the country, with a mandate to draw up a new constitution. These negotiations took place amid pervasive and escalating violence, especially in the southern Transvaal, the industrial heart of the country, and in Natal. Most of the conflicts in the Transvaal occurred between Zulu migrant workers, who were housed in large hostels, and the residents of the adjacent townships. The conflicts in Natal existed mainly between Zulu supporters of the ANC and members of the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, a Zulu movement led by Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was Chief Minister of the KwaZulu homeland. Nelson Mandela, from shepherd to president. In my country, we go to prison first and then become president. In quote. As the bargaining continued, both Mandela and de Klerk made concessions, with the result that both of them ran the risk of losing the support of their respective constituencies. While whites were loath to forfeit their power and privileges, blacks had hoped to win complete control of the state. A majority of white voters endorsed the negotiating process in a referendum in 1992, but both white and black extremists tried to sabotage the process through various acts of terror. Mandela and de Klerk finally reached a peaceful agreement on the future of South Africa at the end of 1993, an achievement for which they jointly received the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize. In addition, leaders of 18 other parties endorsed an interim constitution, which was to take effect immediately after South Africa's first election by universal suffrage, scheduled for April 1994. A parliament to be elected at that time would oversee the drafting of a permanent constitution for the country. The temporary constitution enfranchised all citizens 18 and older, abolished the homelands, and divided the country into 9 new provinces, with provincial governments receiving substantial powers. It also contained a long list of political and social rights and a mechanism through which blacks could regain ownership of land that had been taken away under apartheid. Nelson Mandela, 1994, election. Nelson Mandela, voting in South Africa's historic 1994 election, the first time in the country's history that all citizens, regardless of race or ethnicity, were allowed to vote. The ANC won almost 2/3 of the 1994 vote, the National Party slightly more than 1/5, and the IFP most of the rest. All three received proportional cabinet representation. The ANC also became the majority party in 7 of the provinces, but the IFP won a majority in KwaZulu-Natal, and the National Party, supported by mixed race, people formerly classified as colored under apartheid, as well as white voters, won a majority in Western Cape. Mandela was sworn in as president of the new South Africa on May 10th before a vast, jubilant crowd that included the Secretary-General of the UN, 45 heads of state, and delegations from many other countries. Thabo Mbeki, a top official in the ANC, and de Klerk both became deputy presidents. The new multi-party Government of National Unity aimed to provide Africans with improved education, housing, electricity, running water, and sanitation. Recognizing that economic growth was essential for such purposes, the ANC adopted a moderate economic policy, dropping the socialist elements that had characterized its earlier programs. Mandela and his colleagues campaigned vigorously for foreign aid and investment, but capital investment entered the new South Africa slowly. The government also had to grapple with a host of daunting institutional problems associated with the transition to a post-apartheid society. Blacks joined the civil service. Anti-apartheid guerrillas became members of the police and the army. and new municipal governments that embraced both the old white cities and their black township satellites sprang into existence. Labor disputes, criminal violence, and conflict between Zulu factions, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, continued. The IFP, which supported a new provincial constitution that granted sweeping autonomy to KwaZulu-Natal but was struck down by the Constitutional Court, refused to participate in the process that resulted in the creation of the new national constitution that Parliament passed in May 1996. Parliament revised the constitution in October after it was reviewed by the Constitutional Court. Mandela signed it into law in December of the same year. Also, in 1996, the National Party left the government to form a dynamic but responsible opposition. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The most important domestic agency created during Mandela's presidency was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, which was established to review atrocities committed during the apartheid years. It was set up in 1995 under the leadership of Archbishop Tutu and was given the power to grant amnesty to those found to have committed gross violations of human rights under extenuating circumstances. The Commission released the first 5 volumes of its final report on October 29, 1998, and the remaining 2 volumes on March 21, 2003. In all, the TRC received more than 7,000 amnesty applications, held more than 2,500 amnesty hearings, and granted some 1,500 amnesties for thousands of crimes committed during the apartheid years. Applicants not given amnesty were subject to further legal proceedings. The TRC was the target of widespread criticism. Whites saw it as selectively targeting them, and blacks viewed its actions as a charade that allowed perpetrators of heinous crimes to go free. Former President P.W. Botha refused to answer a summons to give testimony to the commission and received a fine and a suspended sentence, although the sentence was later appealed and overturned. Nonetheless, the TRC uncovered information that otherwise would have remained hidden or taken longer to surface. For example, details of the murders of numerous ANC members were exposed, as were the operations of the state counterinsurgency unit at Vlakplaas. Its commander, Colonel Eugene de Kock, was subsequently sentenced to a long prison term. The commission also investigated those opposed to apartheid. One of the most prominent was Winnie Madikizela Mandela, the former wife of Nelson Mandela. The TRC report indicated that she had been involved in apartheid-era violence. The report also allowed many to finally learn the fate of relatives or friends who had disappeared at the hands of the authorities. The Mbeki presidency, Thabo Mbeki, South African politician, who served as president of the African National Congress, 1997-2007, and president of the country, 1999-2008. Mbeki replaced Mandela as president of the ANC in December 1997 and became president of the country after the ANC's triumphant win in the June 1999 elections. Mbeki pledged to address economic woes and the need to improve the social conditions in the country. The ANC was again victorious in the April 2004 elections, and Mbeki was elected to serve another term. South Africa had entered the 21st century with enormous problems to resolve, but the smooth transition of power in a government that represented a majority of the people, something unthinkable less than a decade earlier, provided hope that those problems could be addressed peaceably. Leonard Monteith Thompson, Julian R.D. Cobbing, corruption charges against Deputy President Zuma. In March 2005, Deputy President Jacob Zuma, who was widely held to be Mbeki's successor as president of the ANC and, eventually, as president of the country, was dismissed by Mbeki amid charges of corruption and fraud. The next year, Zuma stood trial for an unrelated charge of rape. He was acquitted of rape in May 2006, and the corruption charges were dropped later that year. Despite the repeated allegations of wrongdoing, which his supporters claimed were politically motivated, Zuma remained a popular figure within the ANC and was selected over Mbeki to be party president at the ANC conference in December 2007, in what was one of the most contentious leadership battles in the party's history. Later that month, Zuma was recharged with corruption and fraud, and additional charges were brought against him. All charges were eventually dismissed in September 2008 on a legal technicality, but prosecutors from the National Prosecuting Agency, NPA, vowed to appeal the ruling. Mbeki steps down. Ironically, it was perhaps Mbeki, rather than Zuma, who was most politically harmed by the controversy surrounding Zuma's corruption charges. Following an allegation by a High Court judge that there had been political interference, allegedly by Mbeki or at his behest, in Zuma's prosecution on corruption-related charges, on September 20, 2008, Mbeki was asked by the ANC to resign from the South African presidency, which he agreed to do once the relevant constitutional requirements had been fulfilled. On September 25, he was succeeded by Kgalema Motlanthe, who was selected by the National Assembly to serve as interim president until elections could be held in 2009. The Zuma presidency. The 2009 national election. As the 2009 elections drew near, the spotlight was once again on the corruption-related charges against Zuma and the allegations of political interference, culminating in an announcement by the National Prosecuting Authority, NPA, on April 6, 2009, that the charges would be withdrawn. Although prosecutors stated that they felt the charges had merit, they noted evidence of misconduct in the handling of Zuma's case. Opposition parties condemned the announcement, alleging that the NPA bowed to pressure from the ANC to drop the charges before the election, and complained that the NPA's actions left the question of Zuma's innocence unresolved. The ANC, however, was unscathed by the pre-election drama. It finished far ahead of the other parties in the April 22 national election, winning almost 66% of the vote, and Zuma was poised to become the country's next president. He was officially elected to the presidency in a National Assembly vote held on May 6. He was inaugurated on May 9. Economic problems, social discontent, Nkandla scandal, and the death of Mandela. Jacob Zuma. The president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, speaking at the Sports for Peace Gala, Johannesburg, 2010. As president, Zuma had to contend with economic problems and social discontent. There were several long-term strikes, some of which resulted in violence, such as the 2012 incident at a platinum mine at Marikana, where police opened fire on striking miners and more than 34 people were killed and scores more were injured. The unemployment rate hovered around 25%. Many South Africans were disgruntled with the pace of progress of the ANC-led government and complained about inadequate service delivery and overall poor living conditions. Zuma and the ANC also faced allegations of corruption. A notable example was the fury over the costly and extensive upgrades to Zuma's private homestead in Nkandla, KwaZulu-Natal, were later found to have included many additions that were not security-related, such as a swimming pool and an amphitheater. South Africa's public protector, National Ombudsman, Thuli Madonsela, conducted a 2-year investigation into the upgrades and then issued a report calling for Zuma to repay the country for some of the upgrades. He refused. Zuma's publicly funded extravagance rankled when almost half of all South Africans were still living in poverty and struggling to get by. A sign of Zuma's diminishing popularity was evident at a memorial service for Nelson Mandela, the country's beloved former president and ANC icon, who had passed away on December 5, 2013. When Zuma attempted to deliver his speech at the December 10th memorial, he was repeatedly booed by the audience. The 2014 national election. As the May 7, 2014 national election approached, some questioned the ANC's ability to garner a percentage of the votes consistent with its performance in previous elections. The party persevered, though, and won about 62% of the vote, a slight decrease from its 2009 national election share, but still a strong show of support for the party. Trailing after the ANC was the official opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, which obtained some 22% of the vote, and the newly formed party led by former ANC Youth League President Julius Malema, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which won about 6% of the vote. On May 21st, the ANC-dominated National Assembly voted to return Zuma to the presidency. He was inaugurated on May 24th. University fees protests. The largest student protest since the Apartheid era occurred in October 2015, triggered by the news that university fees were going to increase for the upcoming academic year. Poorer, mostly black students said that they would not be able to afford the increase, which would continue the disparity that dated to the Apartheid era, concerning which South Africans were able to gain access to higher education. After a week of protests, during which many universities were shut down, Zuma announced that there would not be a fee increase for 2016. Demonstrations continued at some schools, however, with students demanding free education, as well as making additional demands, which later included a decolonized education. By fall 2016, the demonstrations had picked up steam again, as an increase in university fees for 2017 was anticipated. Controversy: the Gupta family, Nkandla, and corruption charges revisited. Zuma's popularity continued to erode because of scandals. In March 2016, his relationship with the Gupta family, already viewed as controversial, was further questioned when allegations surfaced that the family had promised government portfolios to some people. Also in March, the Nkandla issue rose to the fore again when the Constitutional Court ordered Zuma to repay the state for some of the upgrades made to his home. Furthermore, the court admonished him for his disregard of the public protector's findings, saying it was a failure to uphold, defend, and respect the Constitution. The next month, Zuma faced an impeachment motion by the National Assembly. Although he survived it, many, including some senior-level ANC members, called for him to step down or be recalled. Later in April, corruption-related charges against Zuma that the NPA had dropped in 2009 were in the news again when a high court ruling found that the decision to drop the charges was not rational and should be reviewed and set aside. Both Zuma and the NPA petitioned to be allowed to appeal the decision. The NPA petitioned the Constitutional Court, which denied the request, and Zuma petitioned the Supreme Court, which did allow Zuma's legal team to present arguments as to why they should be allowed to state Zuma's case. After the denial by the Constitutional Court, the NPA filed an appeal with the Supreme Court as well. In October 2017, the Supreme Court ruled that the corruption charges should not have been dismissed and could be reinstated. After a period of review, the NPA announced in March 2018 that it would reinstate 16 charges against Zuma pertaining to corruption, money laundering, racketeering, and fraud. Meanwhile, in August 2016, the ANC experienced its worst performance in an election since the party took power in 1994. In municipal elections held that month, the ANC took less than 60% of the vote and lost control of key urban areas. The election results were widely viewed as being indicative that the electorate was frustrated with the performance of the ANC-led governments at all levels, economic decline, and high rates of unemployment, and the ongoing scandals and allegations of corruption surrounding Zuma. The issue of corruption was again raised a few months later when another investigative report was released by Madantsela's office, this time focusing on the allegations that members of the Gupta family had wielded undue influence on Zuma and other officials. The report, which had been due to be released in mid-October, was initially delayed by a legal challenge from Zuma. He withdrew his challenge on November 2nd, and the report was released later that day. It did not accuse Zuma or anyone else of having committed crimes, but it did mention several instances of possible wrongdoing and requested that the allegations be further investigated by a judicial inquiry team. The report led to a vote of no confidence against Zuma in the National Assembly, but it did not pass. Zuma's resignation. The Nkandla controversy made news again, this time in December 2017, when the Constitutional Court ruled that the National Assembly had failed to fulfill its obligation to hold Zuma accountable for his actions as they pertained to the scandal. The court instructed the body to establish procedures for the removal of a president from office that would need to be followed in the future. The case, which had been brought to court by the EFF and other opposition parties, and the ruling added more pressure on the scandal-beleaguered Zuma and ANC, raising the specter that Zuma would again face impeachment proceedings or that the ANC would try to force him to resign beforehand in order to avoid the political damage such proceedings would generate in the run-up to the 2019 national election. The latter scenario did indeed happen. After several meetings and negotiation sessions, on February 13, 2018, the ANC announced that it had recalled Zuma. He was expected to respond to the party's recall notice by February 14th, the presumption being that he would acquiesce to the party's request and resign. Although Zuma initially responded to the recall notice by stating that he was being unfairly treated by the ANC and that he had done nothing wrong, he did resign on February 14, 2018. Cyril Ramaphosa, a successful businessman and popular anti-apartheid figure who had narrowly been elected president of the ANC in December 2017, was also deputy president of the country, and, as such, he automatically became acting president upon Zuma's resignation. Ramaphosa was officially elected president by the National Assembly and sworn in the next day. The Ramaphosa presidency. Accomplishments and challenges. With Ramaphosa's past business success and his commitment to fighting corruption, his ascendancy to the presidency brought much optimism in South Africa and abroad. He quickly ordered probes of alleged corruption at two government-controlled entities, Eskom, the electricity utility, and Transnet, a transportation and logistics company. In February 2019, Ramaphosa announced the creation of a special tribunal to expedite the handling of corruption cases and to recover stolen public funds. It began work in October. Although Ramaphosa and his administration made some positive strides, the scope of the challenges they faced, as well as resistance from others in the ANC aligned with Zuma, limited how much progress could be achieved. He also had to embrace some policy positions that he previously did not hold, such as how to approach the issue of land reform, which was needed to address the persistent racial disparity in land ownership in the country. Whereas Ramaphosa had long held to a more moderate and cautious approach to redistributing land, he now committed to the controversial approach favored by the Zuma faction of the ANC and the EFF of expropriating land, without compensation to the owners, so that it could be redistributed to Black South Africans. The 2019 national election. The next national election was held on May 8, 2019. The ANC garnered the most votes, but, with an electorate unhappy about the long-running culture of corruption and scandal, economic woes, and the racial inequality that continued to persist more than 2 decades after the end of apartheid, the party's win was by the narrowest margin since taking power. The National Assembly voted for Ramaphosa to continue as president on May 22, and he was sworn in 3 days later. In the following days, he announced his new cabinet, in which women were appointed to half of the posts. This was the first gender-balanced cabinet in South African history. Cyril Ramaphosa. The President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking in Pretoria, South Africa, July 22, 2022. Like most countries in the world, South Africa was affected by the deadly COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Not only did it strain the country's healthcare system, but it also served to accentuate the inequities among South Africa's different groups that persisted from the apartheid era. In March 2020, Ramaphosa declared a state of disaster, which remained in place until April 2022. Although his handling of the pandemic was initially viewed in a positive light, he later garnered criticism as the pandemic dragged on and frustrations with restrictions meant to stem the spread of the virus, and as well as with the country's faltering economy grew. Farmgate controversy and investigations. Ramaphosa's reputation as being tough on corruption took a hit in June 2022 when he was accused of criminal conduct. Arthur Fraser, an ally of Zuma and previous head of the country's state security agency, filed a complaint alleging that Ramaphosa had covered up a theft in 2020 of at least $4 million in foreign money that had been kept in a couch at Ramaphosa's Fala Fala game farm. Fraser also alleged that Ramaphosa had been involved with the kidnapping and bribing of suspects in the robbery. The allegations raised several questions, including where such a large amount of foreign currency came from and if it had been properly declared by Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa attempted to refute the claims of misconduct, explaining that a smaller amount of money had been stolen from Fala Fala in February 2020 at a time when he was not there, and that he reported the theft once he had been made aware of it. He claimed that the stolen money was from the sale of animals from his game farm in late 2019. However, the appearance of misconduct persisted when the details provided by Ramaphosa and his staff surrounding the incident were sometimes vague and on occasion appeared contradictory. Notably, it did not appear that the purchased animals had actually left the farm in the years after the alleged sale. The controversy over the matter, which had become known as Farmgate, led some to call for Ramaphosa's resignation. The National Assembly opened a Section 89 investigation in September 2022 to determine whether impeachment proceedings against the president were warranted. On November 30th, the Section 89 panel report was submitted to the National Assembly. It found that Ramaphosa's actions surrounding the Farmgate scandal might have violated the country's constitution, though he rejected the report's conclusions and continued to declare his innocence. The National Assembly met on December 13th to discuss the report's findings and decide whether impeachment proceedings should be initiated against him. However, the ANC, which had the highest number of members in the body, had instructed its members to reject the call for an impeachment inquiry, so it was not unexpected when the majority of the National Assembly voted against it. Various government agencies, including the Office of the Public Protector, National Ombudsman, and the South African Reserve Bank, SARB, also opened investigations into the matter. The preliminary findings of the Public Protector's investigation, leaked in March 2023, indicated that no evidence of wrongdoing by Ramaphosa had been found. This was confirmed by the official investigation report released in June. SRB's investigation focused on whether he had violated Exchange Control Regulation 6(1), which stipulated, "Every person resident in the Republic who becomes entitled to sell or to procure the sale of any foreign currency shall within 30 days after becoming so entitled make or cause to be made a declaration in writing of such foreign currency to the Treasury or to an authorized dealer." SRB's report, dated August 2023, included a statement from the identified buyer of the animals, who referred to the money as a security deposit and said the delivery of the animals had been delayed for reasons that included the COVID-19 pandemic. SRB found that Ramaphosa had not violated Exchange Control Regulation 6(1) because the money was stolen before the sale was finalized. The investigation and report were heavily criticized by many, including members of the Democratic Alliance, DA, and other political parties. The 2024 national election. Preparations for the 2024 national election, scheduled for May 29th, differed from previous elections. This was largely due to the Electoral Amendment Act of 2023, which among its reforms included a provision for independent candidates to contest seats in the National Assembly and in provincial legislatures. Previously, one had to be affiliated with a political party in order to do so. The allowance for independent candidates meant that instead of voters having to cast one ballot to fill the seats of the National Assembly, they would now cast two. Half of the legislative body's seats would be filled from a national ballot, which would be identical across the country and list political parties that had qualified to contest the election, and the other half would be filled from a regional ballot, the contents of which would be dependent upon the province in which a voter resided and would include independent candidates as well as political parties. A third ballot would be used for provincial legislature elections, which were also being held that day. Another significant difference with the upcoming election is that it was the first since the ANC took power in 1994 that the party was in danger of not winning an outright majority in the National Assembly. The party had seen its support erode over the years because of reasons such as the parade of corruption scandals, a lack of economic progress, and persisting inequalities among the country's peoples. After 30 years, many South Africans were frustrated with the status quo under the ANC-led government. The country's high unemployment rate, in the first quarter of 2024, it stood at 32.9% and was even higher for younger South Africans, ages 15-34, at 45.5%, as well as service delivery problems, such as Eskom's ongoing struggles to consistently deliver electricity, influenced voters' opinions. The ANC's diminishing support meant that a governing coalition might need to be formed for the first time in the post-apartheid era. Though such a coalition would likely consist of the ANC and another party, or parties, DA leader John Steenhuisen formed the Multi-Party Charter, MPC, an alliance of opposition parties that hoped to unseat the ANC. Further complicating the ANC's efforts to retain a majority was the emergence of a new party, Umkhonto weSizwe Party, MK Party. Former President Zuma, although not leaving the ANC, associated himself with the MK Party, saying he could not campaign for the ANC under Ramaphosa in the upcoming elections. Zuma was later named president of the new party. The MK party had already proved its ability to take a stake of the ANC's traditional vote in by-elections held in early 2024, a trend that seemed likely to carry over to the national as well as the provincial elections. Although Zuma had been at the top of the MK party's National Assembly candidate list, a challenge to his eligibility to serve in the legislative body, stemming from his 2021 prison sentence, saw him knocked off the list when the Constitutional Court deemed him ineligible just 9 days before the election. The national and provincial elections took place on May 29, 2024. As predicted, the ANC's diminished support led to the party's worst-ever performance in a national election. The party won only about 40% of the vote. It was followed by the DA, with almost 22%, and the MK party, with about 14%. As the ANC was not able to win a majority of National Assembly seats, the country awaited the outcome of discussions to form a governing coalition. Though a partnership between the ANC and DA made sense from the standpoint of having the greatest numbers in the National Assembly, some ANC members were strongly resistant to the idea of working with the DA, which they viewed as serving the interests of the wealthy and the minority white population. Such a partnership also risked upsetting the ANC's traditional allies, the South African Communist Party, SACP, and the Trade Union Federation COSATU for similar reasons. On June 6, Ramaphosa announced that the ANC would work toward the formation of a Government of National Unity, GNU, rather than a governing coalition with just one or more partners, and invited the other political parties to enter into talks with the ANC to join. Pursuing a GNU that might include the DA, as well as other parties, would presumably be more palatable to ANC members and allies than a governing coalition comprising only the ANC and DA. Negotiations continued over several days, with clear lines being drawn between the DA and the EFF, both of which refused to work with the other, among others, in part because of their diametrically opposed objectives. The EFF and MK party advocated for land expropriation without compensation and the nationalization of key industries, which the DA opposed, instead supporting a free market approach for the economy. The negotiations to form a GNU went down to the wire, with a statement of intent signed just hours before the newly elected National Assembly was scheduled to sit for the first time on June 14th and elect the president. While the GNU statement initially held only the signatures of officials from the ANC and DA, it was left open for other parties to join. The Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, which had previously confirmed that it would be a part of GNU, later signed, as did the Patriotic Alliance, PA. The EFF and several other smaller parties formed what they called the Progressive Caucus, which planned to serve as the opposition in the new parliament. Late in the night on June 14th, the National Assembly re-elected Ramaphosa as the country's president. He handily defeated the EFF's Malema, who was the only other nominee. In the coming days, the Good Political Party also joined the GNU, which now held just more than two-thirds of the seats in the National Assembly. Ramaphosa was inaugurated for his second term as president on June 19th. Meanwhile, Zuma and the MK party claimed, without providing any evidence, that the election had been rigged and that the party had actually won a much greater percentage of the vote. The party had tried to get the Constitutional Court to block the first seating of the new parliament on June 14th, as well as to overturn the election results, but the party's application was dismissed as being without merit. The MK party boycotted the June 14th parliament session, so its 58 newly elected members of the National Assembly were not sworn in with the rest of the body's members that day. 2 days later, however, the MK party announced that its parliamentarians would be sworn in at a later date and that the party would join the Progressive Caucus. Apartheid, policy that governed relations between South Africa's white minority and non-white majority for much of the latter half of the 20th century, sanctioning racial segregation and political and economic discrimination against non-whites. Although the legislation that formed the foundation of apartheid had been repealed by the early 1990s, the social and economic repercussions of the discriminatory policy persisted into the 21st century. Apartheid legislation. Apartheid-era sign, part of an exhibition in the Apartheid Museum, Johannesburg, South Africa. Racial segregation, sanctioned by law, was widely practiced in South Africa before 1948. But when the National Party, led by Daniel F. Malan, gained office that year, it extended the policy and gave it the name apartheid. The implementation of apartheid, often called separate development since the 1960s, was made possible through the Population Registration Act of 1950, which classified all South Africans as either Bantu, all black Africans, colored, those of mixed race, or white. A fourth category, Asian, Indian, and Pakistani, was later added. One of the other most significant acts in terms of forming the basis of the apartheid system was the Group Areas Act of 1950. It established residential and business sections in urban areas for each race, and members of other races were barred from living, operating businesses, or owning land in them, which led to thousands of coloreds, blacks, and Indians being removed from areas classified for white occupation. In practice, this act and two others in 1954 and 1955, which became known collectively as the Land Acts, completed a process that had begun with similar Land Acts adopted in 1913 and 1936. The end result was to set aside more than 80% of South Africa's land for the white minority. To help enforce the segregation of the races and prevent blacks from encroaching on white areas, the government strengthened the existing pass laws, which required non-whites to carry documents authorizing their presence in restricted areas. Bantustans. A map of the territories known as Bantustans, also known as Black Homelands or Black States, established in South Africa during the apartheid era. Other acts also led to physical separation of the races. Under the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, the government re-established tribal organizations for black Africans, and the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959 created 8, later expanded to 10 African homelands, or Bantustans. The Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act of 1970 made every black South African, irrespective of actual residence, a citizen of one of the Bantustans, which were organized on the basis of ethnic and linguistic groupings defined by white ethnographers. Blacks were stripped of their South African citizenship and thereby excluded from the South African body politic. The South African government manipulated homeland politics so that compliant chiefs controlled the administrations of most of those territories. 4 of the Bantustans, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei, were later granted independence as republics, though none was ever recognized by a foreign government, and the remaining Bantustans had varying degrees of self-government. Regardless of their independence or self-governing status, all the Bantustans remained dependent, both politically and economically, on South Africa. The dependence of the South African economy on non-white labor, though, made it difficult for the government to carry out this policy of separate development. Separate educational standards were established for non-whites. The Bantu Education Act, 1953, provided for the creation of state-run schools, which black children were required to attend, with the goal of training the children for the manual labor and menial jobs that the government deemed suitable for those of their race. The Extension of University Education Act, 1959, largely prohibited established universities from accepting non-white students. The government created new ethnic university colleges, one each for coloreds, Indians, and Zulus, and one each for Soweto, Tswana, and Venda students, as well as a medical school for blacks. How did apartheid change South Africa? 3 decades after apartheid, South Africa is still considered the most unequal country in the world. Other laws were also passed to legalize and institutionalize the apartheid system. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, 1949, and the Immorality Amendment Act, 1950, prohibited interracial marriage or sex. The Suppression of Communism Act, 1950, defined communism and its aims broadly to include any opposition to the government and empowered the government to detain anyone it thought might further communist aims. The Indemnity Act, 1961, made it legal for police officers to commit acts of violence, to torture, or to kill in the pursuit of official duties. The policies dictating the physical and political separation of racial groups were referred to as Grand Apartheid, while the laws and regulations that segregated South Africans in daily activities were known as Petty Apartheid. For example, those that dictated which transportation, recreation, or dining options one could utilize based on race. Uncovering apartheid history in Cape Town's District 6 black activists, including Nelson Mandela, were imprisoned in Cape Town, South Africa, and nearby Robben Island. Aftermath of the deadly Sharpeville demonstration, the wounded being tended to after police opened fire on an anti-apartheid demonstration in Sharpeville, South Africa, 1960. Although the government had the power to suppress virtually all criticism of its policies, there was always some opposition to apartheid within South Africa. Black African groups, with the support of some whites, held demonstrations and strikes, and there were many instances of violent protest and of sabotage. One of the first, and most violent, demonstrations against apartheid took place in Sharpeville on March 21, 1960. The police response to the protesters' actions was to open fire, killing about 69 black Africans and wounding many more. An attempt to enforce Afrikaans language requirements for black African students led to the Soweto uprising in 1976. Thousands of people were injured and hundreds died, including Hector Peterson, whose death, captured in an iconic photo, provoked international outrage. Some white politicians called for the relaxation of the minor, petty apartheid restrictions or for the establishment of racial equality. How Albert Luthuli shaped South Africa's apartheid resistance. I have the feeling that I have been made answerable for the future of the people of South Africa. Apartheid also received international censure. South Africa was forced to withdraw from the Commonwealth in 1961 when it became apparent that other member countries would not accept its racial policies. The United Nations General Assembly denounced apartheid in 1973. 4 years later, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to impose a mandatory embargo on the export of arms to South Africa. In 1985, both the United Kingdom and the United States imposed selective economic sanctions on South Africa. In response to these and other pressures, the South African government abolished the pass laws in 1986, although blacks were still prohibited from living in designated white areas, and the police were granted broad emergency powers. The end of legislated apartheid. Apartheid Museum, Johannesburg, South Africa. Nelson Mandela. Several months after his release from prison, Nelson Mandela addressed the Special Committee Against Apartheid, convened in his honor at the UN General Assembly on June 22, 1990, in New York City. He later became president of the African National Congress and then president of South Africa. In a more fundamental shift of policy, however, the government of South African Pres. W. de Klerk in 1990-91 repealed most of the social legislation that provided the legal basis for apartheid, including the Population Registration Act. Systematic racial segregation remained deeply entrenched in South African society, though, and continued on a de facto basis. A new constitution that enfranchised blacks and other racial groups was adopted in 1993 and took effect in 1994. All-race national elections, also in 1994, produced a coalition government with a black majority led by anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela, the country's first black president. These developments marked the end of legislated apartheid, but not the end of its entrenched social and economic effects. South Africa's journey is a testament to the power of human spirit. Let's honor the past and embrace the future. Together, we can build a brighter tomorrow. As we reflect on South Africa's past, let's remember the sacrifices made and the lessons learned. The future of this beautiful nation lies in our hands. From the ancient Khoikhoi to the Rainbow Nation, South Africa's story is one of resilience, struggle, and triumph. As we've journeyed through the past, we've witnessed the power of hope, the strength of unity, and the enduring spirit of humanity. Let us know in the comments what you think the future holds for South Africa. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating historical content. Thanks for watching and stay tuned in for more updates.